Good afternoon. I'm Teresa Cutlip with the Purchasing Division. Welcome to today's session on West Virginia OASIS Part 1, presented by Lisa Comer, Finance Team Business Analyst. Some of you may have printed out the PowerPoints ahead of time, or you can follow along on your screen. All PowerPoints are posted on our conference website at westvirginiapurchasing.gov. If you did not log in with your first and last name, please log out and back in order to receive credit. If you have multiple people in your agency viewing from a single computer, please complete a sign-in sheet and send to purchasing.training@westvirginia.gov. Everyone attending today will receive a certificate from CourseMeal, but that will take some time because we have to pull reports from WebEx to confirm participation. Please give us a couple of weeks before calling to ask about your certificates. Depending on time, we'll try to answer your questions at the end of this 1-hour session. Go ahead and put your questions in the chat window and send to the host. And we'll get started now with Lisa.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's tough being the first session after lunch. Everybody's bellies are full and everybody's ready to take a nap. But we'll try to keep you, I won't say entertained, but keep you interested in what we have to present today. So part one, we're going to cover some of the basics when it comes to OASIS and procurement. So we do have a full agenda today, and I will try to get through this and save some time for some questions at the end of the session. So to start with, we'll review the basic procurement functionality. We're going to talk about encumbrances, pre-encumbrances and encumbrance documents. We'll review how to create a requisition. And throughout the presentation, I have some pre-recorded demos. So we'll see how that works out, having a pre-recorded demo that I'm going to speak over. We'll talk about document and line references and the importance of those as you progress through the procurement and even into the payment process. We'll create a solicitation document, publishing a solicitation to VSS. So we'll just glimpse at that in part one, and then we'll look a little more into that in part two, and monitoring the OASIS cycle dashboard. Okay, so to start with the procurement functionality, the basic procurement functions within OASIS includes requisitions to the solicitations, evaluations, and the award process. Additionally, and part of the award process are the master agreements and e-catalogs. So I know we have a few agencies that have agreements with electronic catalogs that are utilized. It also includes vendor registration. So when vendors register to do business with the state, with the purchasing division, and pay the vendor registration fee, that can all be accommodated within OASIS. There's the vendor self-service portal, inventory management, encumbrance, and then receiving is also considered part of the procurement functions. So these are the procurement states. This is the process you go through each step of the way when you are have determined that there is a need for a particular good or service within your agency. Typically, you would start with a requisition, and keep in mind, you may have policies and procedures for those that fall under the purchasing division and the central procurement process. And then there are some that are agency delegated or have exemptions. So we've tried to accommodate both. And what I'm going to focus on mostly today is the process and the various documents and how to process those in the system, not necessarily so much on policies and procedures. We'll leave that to the experts that have sessions throughout the rest of the week. So you'd start with the requisition. That is the request that is created, again, once you've determined that there's a particular need for a good or service within your agency. Next would come the solicitation state. So that's where you've prepared your requisition, you're ready to put that particular need out to bid and put that bid opportunity out for potential vendors to respond to. And then, of course, is the vendors responding to those solicitations, those bid opportunities. There's the evaluation process, which also has an evaluation document to accommodate that decision and awarding your contract or your award, which is the next state, the award process. And then your post-award state would include everything after that award has been made. So if you have change orders or modification versions, it could be an accounting adjustment, an invoice, your payment request, and the receiving document are all considered part of the post-award process. So one thing to remember, it's very important, from the very beginning of the process to make sure that you know what your policies and procedures are. So for example, you need to know what you are able to do at the agency delegated level and what is required to go through the purchasing division. That is very important to know up front, because if you do not select the correct document code, agency or central, then you could end up creating additional work, unnecessary work for yourself. You can see here on the procurement documents that we have listed for the various procurement states, you have centralized and you have decentralized. The decentralized, we typically refer to those as the agency level. So each document type, each document code, for the most part, has a prefix that starts with a C or an A. They represent central or agency. That central is purchasing. The agency is anything that you would have that you would be allowed through policy and procedure to process at the agency delegated level, or if you're an agency that has an exemption. It could be a full agency exemption, or it could be that you have a partial exemption that allows you to process specific types of purchases at the agency delegated level. These document codes and the prefixes, they determine the workflow that document is going to go through. So if you don't select the right one at the beginning, you cannot change that document code once you have created it and started the process. You have to start over again with the correct code. And that's typical in most systems. Once you've started through a process, you can't just flip it and say, oh, I didn't mean for that to be agency, it needed to be central, or vice versa. So once you've determined that there's a need, you need to have some idea of, what you anticipate that cost to be, so if that needs to go down the central purchasing division route, or it can be processed completely end to end at the agency level. So when you create that requisition, let's just use the central, for example, with purchasing division, and you've created that requisition. You're going to create the CRQS. Next, you could, and we'll talk about the copy forward here in a minute, you would follow that through. Every document in that state is going to be a central document, one that is going to be workflowed through the purchasing division. Now you'll notice there's 2 documents on this list that do not have an agency or central version. And that is because those particular documents do not have workflow involved. So there was no need to clone those documents and create an agency version and a central version. The SR document for solicitation responses and the evaluation document, that is the only document code that exists for those that you would be using, regardless of whether it's agency or central. Okay, so again, between agency and central, it's very important if you're selecting a document code that starts with a C, a central document such as the CRQS or a CRFQ, those are going to, once they have completed all of the required levels of approval at the agency level, will automatically workflow to the purchasing division so that all of the necessary requirements and approvals from the purchasing division are met, and in most cases, additionally, approval by the Attorney General's office. Agency documents, so those that begin with an A, again, those are not going to need to be workflow beyond your agency level. So whatever workflow process you have set up internally within your agency level, those documents would go final at the agency level and would not be workflowed to the purchasing division. And this is just a list of the various procurement types. We have, since this list was put together, we did just this past year also implement the grant module. So you will see a grant award at the bottom of the list if Courtney wants to highlight that. The bottom. The grant award document has been there since the beginning, but we've implemented the grants module. So there is now a new procurement type of document called the GFA, or the GFO, the Grant Funding Opportunity. And of course, those are grants. That was the result of COVID and the pandemic and the CARES Act. We quickly implemented the grants module. So the GFA or GFO, Grant Funding Opportunity, is a new document type that you may see. So if you come across that and you're like, what is this? That is what it is, and what the grant funding opportunities they publish to vendor self-service as well. Okay, so again, you can see we have just to provide a picture for you and show that the process and the workflow for procurement documents when it comes to the copy forward process is the same whether it's at an agency delegated level, agency document, or a central document through the purchasing division. So what the copy forward process does, and it's very important, it's the copy forward. There's a copy button and a copy forward that are right beside of each other, and they have very different purposes. Copy is doing just that. It's taking a document, and maybe you have a requisition and a past requisition, and then you have another need come up that's very similar. Rather than creating that new document, you can use a past requisition and click copy, and that will create an exact image of that previous requisition, and then you could tweak it as you need and use that if you wanted to. But we're going to talk about the copy forward process, and what that does, it allows you to take a document in that procurement state and copy that document forward to create the next document in the procurement state. So if you're starting with the requisition, and we'll use the right column with the central purchasing, for example, and you've created your central requisition. Now, I believe for your central requisitions, those actually go to the purchasing division, and then purchasing division will copy that forward and create the solicitation document for you. If it's an agency level document, then you would be doing all of that internally. So pay attention so you know how to do what the experts at purchasing division are doing for you on your central documents. So you can take that requisition, you can copy it forward to create your solicitation document. And I'm going to be using the RFQ as an example because probably 90% of the solicitation types you do are RFQ, but it could be an RFP possibly, it could be a sole source determination, a request for information. You can create any of those types of solicitation documents by copying forward from the requisition. So from the solicitation document, you can copy it forward to create a number of documents in the next few steps of the procurement process. You can copy that forward to create a solicitation response document. So if you've allowed both online solicitation responses from VSS, as well as vendors to mail in their responses, you can document that paper response or that other some type of response outside of VSS. You can record those by creating a solicitation response, an SR document within OASIS on the financial side. So you can copy forward from the solicitation document to create the SR document, and then you just input the specific vendor response information to record that. And then, you can copy forward from the solicitation document to create your EV document, the evaluation document, and then create your award document, so your purchase order, your contract, or your master agreement from within the evaluation document. So I believe purchasing uses the EV document to award most of their contracts. I know some agencies use the EV and some don't, but it's a good, using the EV, and I'll show you what the EV looks like here in a demonstration shortly. It's a good way to have all of your responses side by side to evaluate and review those. And you'll notice the delivery order, you can't copy forward from anything to create the delivery order. That is just created through the shop. And if we have time, I'll have a demonstration. I'll run through that as well. Okay, let's talk about encumbrances. So we have pre-encumbrance versus encumbrance. So to encumber funds, that means, of course, to set aside or reserve those funds for a specific purpose. that is what your pre-encumbrance, your requisition document does. So your requisition is pre-encumbering those funds, setting those aside and reserving those for that, again, good or service that you have determined your agency needs to put out for bid. And then the encumbrance comes when you actually award that contract. And if you're following the process as we go along, and I'm going to emphasize the importance of all of these line references and document references, the system will do a lot of the work for you if you keep everything intact and kind of use this copy forward process and bring all of those references from a previous document forward. And it will liquidate, pre-encumbrances, for example, from once the award is made. Okay, two methods for encumbering. As I mentioned, there's the requisition, which is a pre-encumbrance, and then your award documents are actually an encumbrance. There's also accounting-based, which those, when you're processing purchase orders through the purchasing division or even agency delegated, we don't use the GAEs or the GAPs, but those are general accounting-based, the general accounting encumbrance and the general accounting pre-encumbrance, just so you're familiar with those documents. And those are used a lot of times in conjunction with a GACS, like if you wanted to reserve those funds and that wasn't something required to go to purchasing, you could reserve your funds that way and then record the payment to those. Okay, the event types. The event types, those control whether the dollar amount that you are needing to reserve is going to be encumbered now or encumbered in the future. So you may have a contract that crosses fiscal years, or you may have a contract that has multiple out years. You can create those accounting lines and use these event types to determine if that money is going to be committed or encumbered in the current fiscal year, or if it crosses years and you need part of that money reserved for the next fiscal year, it will automatically roll during our year-end closeout process at either the end of June or July, depending on the funding type, and encumber those funds that you've already set up with an out year for you. And so here's just an example, if you were crossing fiscal years, because, all of your contracts don't go clean from July to June and coincide with the state's fiscal year. They may run from January to December. They may run, whenever you determine that need is. So if you need to set those up in the cross fiscal years or have additional fiscal years, out years, you can use these event types on your accounting lines. Okay, requisitions for master agreements. There are specific requisition types, documents for the master agreements, and there are specific ones for the reason that master agreements do not encumber funds. Your typical requisition, the ARQS and the CRQS, those that are familiar with those documents know that those require all of the detailed accounting information. So your fund, appropriation unit, all of that information is required because they're actually pre-encumbering your funds. Award documents require accounting, all of the accounting information at the fund level. The requisition for master agreements, it may require you or will require you to add an accounting line, but it does not require all of that detailed information because there's no encumbrance or pre-encumbrance necessary for master agreements. The encumbrance comes against those on the delivery order. So you can save yourself some headache and some time by not including all of that detailed accounting information on your requisitions for master agreements, because when you do enter that information, it does, and this is odd, even though the master agreement itself, that document does not contain an accounting section, you have that linkage to the requisition, and if you enter detailed information there, it will come back to haunt you down the road. We see it all the time. So on those RQM documents, the event type would be PR01, your reserve funding, yes, and then just allow the current budget fiscal year to be inferred and leave the fund accounting and detailed accounting tabs blank. I know, oftentimes it's like, every field we see, we think we have to put that information in there, and Sometimes less is more. Less is more sometimes. The maximum budgeted amount on these documents, it does not encumber or pre-encumber or reserve any funds. It's simply there for informational purposes. So if you wanted to put a maximum budgeted amount on your requisition, just for, going through the evaluation process, you know that you only have $30,000 that you are allowed to spend on this particular purchase. You can document that in the maximum budgeted amount on your requisition if you wanted to. Just know, again, it does not encumber or pre-encumber any funds from that field. So this is just a screenshot of the requisition for your master agreements. Just a screenshot to show, again, the event type that you would use and your reserve funding. You could put a line amount if you wanted for your informational purposes. And then the fund accounting. You're going to leave this blank because it is of no benefit. There's no downstream benefit at all to completing this. It can cause you problems, however, if you enter this information down the road. Okay, creating a requisition. So to start with, of course, you're going to, once you've determined if there's the desired purchase requires a central or agency level, again, it's very important to make sure you determine that at the beginning. You also want to, evaluate, does this need to be on a purchase order? Is it going to be a one and done deal? Does it need to be on a contract because it's going to have renewal periods? Or does it need to be, on an open-end type contract that would be on a master agreement? You're going to select your procurement type ID early on in the process. Also, you need to be aware of any third-party approvals that are required for that particular purchase. So if it's, for example, banking, then the treasurer's office typically has to approve purchases for banking services. If it's a vehicle, then fleet may have to approve it. Legal services, even if it's agency delegated, if it's legal services outside of the Attorney General's office, they need to typically approve those. And then technology type purchases, of course, the Office of Technology would need to approve those. So we have a process to identify those types of purchases that need to be workflowed to a third-party approver, and we'll talk about those in a second. The reporting fields, there are 7 reporting fields on your procurement document. So starting with the requisition, and that is required. So in reporting field 1, that's where you're going to record the type of solicitation. So again, probably 90% of those are the RFQ. So you would enter 10 is the RFQ type. Reporting field 2, that is where you're going to identify if this is a purchase that requires a third-party approval. So you must use reporting field 2, identify who that third-party approver is so that that can be included in the workflow process. And then reporting field 4, that is there for agency use. So anything you want to record in that field to report on, that is yours to use. And the remaining 4 fields, those are reserved for potential future use. For example, the reporting field 2, if we ever need to use another field at the state, state level, we have those reserved for that purpose. So the instructions for the third-party approvals, those are located on My Apps. And again, these are some of the examples. This is not necessarily all-inclusive list, but these are some of the most popular examples of purchases that would require a third-party approval. So you want to make sure, again, that you're aware of those policies and procedures, which agencies require you to go through them for an additional approval before you make any of those purchases. Because that in some cases needs to be approved by them at the requisition level, and then again it has to be approved by them at the award level. And this is where you can find those procedures once you indicate in reporting field 2 which third-party approval is needed, the steps for how you go about reassigning that requisition or that award document to that third-party approver are located on My Apps. Okay, so we're going to move on to creating a requisition. And so again, we're just going to walk you through the steps of how you create the document in the system. And at the same time, you need to keep in mind any additional policies and procedures that the purchasing division may have, or if you're an exempt agency or have an agency delegated purchase, what your agency's policies and procedures are that you may need to do in addition to this. So this is just to walk you through creating the document to record that transaction in OASIS. And I have some pre-recorded demos that I've inserted because the last thing I wanted to attempt to do was a live demo from our test environment where others are actively testing, and you know, sometimes and every now and then we get a little issue or a glitch reported in the system. And so that's where, unfortunately, we have the test environment is where we have to do any kind of training or anything like that. And you never know what's going to happen if they need to bounce it. So I've pre-recorded some demos and I'm going to try to speak to them. And so hopefully the order that I did things when I recorded them is how I'm going to speak to them today. So hopefully these will be helpful to you. Sometimes I know it helps to have a picture. You know, it's easier to see it if you have a picture rather than it is somebody just talking to it and throwing a bunch of words on the screen to you. So we'll try to just go through that. So to create your requisition, you know, a couple of ways, like with all of the other documents, it's just a matter of personal preference. You can use the Jump To field if you know the document code to create it, or you can go to the document catalog at your preference. And again, you know, you've had to determine if that is going to be an agency delegated, if it qualifies for an agency delegated or is exempt or needs to go through the purchasing division. And again, you know, is it going to be a purchase order or a contract, or is it going to be a master agreement? So a lot of decisions you need to make ahead of time before you start down the process. So what I'm going to do is these next couple of slides are just kind of a checklist that we've put together to kind of help you know what some of the required fields are as you're creating the requisition document. So you can follow along on those if you have your handouts printed if you want. And then I'm going to skip over to the demo slide. And let's see how this goes. Okay, so I'm going to create a requisition with the way that I like to use the system, and I am a fan of the Jump To. So I'm like, forget the document catalog, I can go to the Jump To. And I know that in this case, I'm going to need to create a central requisition. So this is one that I know would need to go to the purchasing division. So I'm going to enter, of course, your department and unit is always required. Your 3-character, for the most part, they're 3-character. There's a few exceptions. I think we allowed a few that have 4-character. Procurement prefix is always required. So auto numbering, that's always required in most instances. And we have our requisition document created. So we have a CRQS, we have our document ID, we're in draft phase. We're going to enter our document name and description because that's required. And State Fair just wrapped up. So I'm going to buy some of their leftover livestock. Pretend. Okay, so let me pause it here. As you can see, after the document name and the description, your procurement type ID. The system does not know if you're wanting this to eventually end up to be a purchase order or a contract. And for that matter, a lot of times the RQS is used for master agreements. I don't recommend it, but it happens sometimes. So the system doesn't know what type, and you need to select the procurement type ID that you anticipate this to result in. So I've selected a central purchase order. And there's that maximum budgeted amount. So again, that field, it's not encumbering or pre-encumbering any funds. It's just so I know because my budget director said, you've got a max $30,000. I'm going to let you spend on this livestock that you don't really need. Hopefully nobody's buying anything they don't really need. Okay, so under the contact information, your issuer ID, that's who's creating the document, that's inferred. The requester, that's going to be maybe your director, your manager, it could be your cabinet secretary, whoever has requested you to purchase this particular good or service. Your buyer for your central documents needs to be your purchasing division buyer, not your agency buyer. I'm going to enter an extended description. That's not required, but you know, it helps to have a little additional information to remind yourself maybe down the road. If you're like me and you can't remember anything anymore. Okay, default shipping and billing, that's going to be your agency's shipping and billing information. Because ultimately for a central one, it's going to end up at the purchasing division, but they don't want to receive your items and they certainly don't want to pay for your items. So they don't want to be receiving the bill. You can put in a delivery date. You know, that delivery date, you're not going to be held to that. That's just your anticipated date that you would expect to have those delivered. Okay, and then the reporting. So this is where you would go to select your solicitation type. So, you know, this is just a typical RFQ. And if this was a purchase, we don't have any third-party approvals for livestock. I don't think agriculture has asked for that yet. But you can see here the list. If this was a purchase that fell under one of these categories, you would need to populate that reporting field too, so that it goes through the proper workflow approvals and you obtain that third-party approver. Okay, so we've finished the header section of our requisition. Now, I've got to go back into my requisition because I recorded these in piecemealed them. So it wouldn't be one gigantic long video. We're going to go back into the requisition. I felt some of you needed that repeated and I was going to play it again, but we won't. Okay, so we'll move on to the commodity section next. And again, there's just some slides for the commodity and the accounting sections if you wanted to follow along on that checklist. And we'll demonstrate those sections of the requisition as well. So you've already completed the header section. We're going to the commodity section and we need to insert a line. We need to pick our commodity code. So those of you that are familiar with commodity codes, you know, with the UNSPSC codes, that's what the state uses. You can go as you know, generic as livestock or detailed as you want to be or need to be. I'm just picked the generic livestock. I'm going to buy a variety of animals. The commodity line description, if you don't enter anything there, it's going to automatically default when you save or validate the document to what the commodity code description is, but you can enter your own detailed information description there if you like. You're going to enter, you know, you can enter a unit price or you can leave it at 0. So if you know, you have a price in mind that you're thinking, oh, those cattle are probably $1,000 a head, you can put that in there. It's kind of your max amount that you want to spend for each to reserve those funds. Now, if you put 0 in there, you're not reserving anything. So, you know, if you want to reserve those funds, you can do that and put those amounts in there. So you can see we don't have, you know, obviously this is a requisition. It comes before the solicitation. So that information is not there yet. Your shipping and billing information, that's, we've populated that from the header section. So you don't have to re-enter all of that information. So that's a good trick to know is you can just go to related actions and click that ship and bill to from the header section. So your accounting, you need to enter your accounting information. Purchasing's not going to do that for you. So all of your required elements, and I'm just entering the minimum required here. You may have more detailed accounting information depending on how complex you've set yours up and how you need to distribute that. You may even go to the detailed accounting level and put program and that information in if that's what you need to do. So I've validated because I wanted that to populate the object code for me. So I can verify that if that's the correct object code, and then from there, just go and select the sub-object code. Now, one thing I want to point out is on the sub-objects, and there are object codes like this as well. Unless you are higher education, do not select an object or sub-object code that starts with an H. Those are reserved for them. Unless you are transportation, do not use an object or sub-object code that begins with a T, because those are reserved for transportation. I say that because we've had that done. Okay, so I only have one option to choose from here. That's the first one because I'm not higher education and I'm not transportation. So then I can validate my document. And it validates successfully. Now, I can also populate information in the vendor section. So we're going to go to the vendor section next. And again, there's a checklist for you. It just kind of explains. So you can use the vendor section and the freeform vendor section to include vendors that you want to be carried over when you copy forward. So again, that copy forward, there's a lot of benefit to that because everything you enter on the requisition is going to be automatically inferred over onto the solicitation document, including any vendors that you want to make sure get a notification of this bid opportunity. You know, there's a lot of vendors that use vendor self-service, but you know, you as a buyer or a procurement officer don't know what vendors are in VSS, or if they even have an email address populated on their vendor account in VSS, or for that matter, that they've signed up for that commodity code to receive notifications. So if you've got specific vendors you want to make sure gets this notification, add them to the vendor section or to the freeform section if you don't know an email address for that. Or if you don't know that they're in, if they're in the vendor section, in the vendor section, they have to be on the vendor customer table. So if you don't know, you know, you just have this vendor salesperson's name and their email address, you can add them to the freeform section. So we're going to pretend Dan Miller in his new retired life as a vendor. So we want to make sure that Dan Miller gets this notification. So he's in the vendor customer table. So we've added him to the vendor list section because he has a vendor customer account. We see that he has an email on file on his vendor account. And then in the freeform section, you can add vendors, like I said, if you've got a salesperson and you don't want to take the time to see if they have an account in VSS, you can enter that salesperson's name and email address to make sure that they get the solicitation notification. Additionally, we recommend you can do this. You can enter your own agency information. So if you, as the requester, or you want your agency buyer to get the same notifications that the vendor gets, which is helpful. It's helpful sometimes if you see what the vendor's getting. You can add yourself or others in your agency to the freeform vendor section. Just put your name and your email address and select the correspondence type of email, and you will also see those notifications. Okay, so now that we've entered the vendor information that we want to be carried over if it's essential, when purchasing copies forward your requisition to a solicitation, it's there. So you can see I submitted the document and it is now in pending. And you can go, let me just back it up a little bit there. You can go to the workflow and track work in progress and that will show you where your document now stands. So I've submitted it. There's 3 levels of approval at my particular agency that document goes through before it even makes it to purchasing division. And you can see the 2 levels of approval once it gets to the purchasing division, state purchasing division. Okay, and I would say that's all there is to the requisition, but your purchasing buyer may need a little bit more from you. So that's all that's required as far as creating your document at the requisition level. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. Let me see where we are on time. Okay. Let's talk about document and line references. I want to talk about that early in the process so that you can maybe understand the importance of those as you progress through the various procurement states and forward, going from one document to the next, how important those references are. Okay, so document references, those are created when you copy a document forward. So for example, going from the requisition, the next thing that we're going to look at is copying forward to our solicitation document. So when you copy forward that document to create the next one in the state, those references are going to be populated for you as you go through those various states. So even when you get to the award document, you're going to have references back, document references back to your solicitation, back to your requisition. And it's very important to make sure that you do not delete those requisitions out. They are there for a number of reasons. One, just for that, the purpose of the cross-reference there, what requisition and what solicitation came prior to that award document, but they play a very important role as well. If you remove the requisition documents from your award document, guess what? It's not going to liquidate your pre-encumbrance because that document's not there. And that can cause some problems as well. So that's something that we work with agencies, especially when it comes to year-end closeout. Everybody's always trying to free up their money or push it out to the next year. And a lot of times there's some pre-encumbrances that are left out there. And sometimes we find it's because that requisition reference has been deleted from the award document. So let's talk a little bit more about document and line references. So each commodity line has a reference tab. So you'll find that throughout the various procurement documents. So even on the requisition, you saw when we created the requisition, there was a reference tab. And then when you go to the solicitation document, there's reference tabs. And the award document has reference tabs. And at the commodity line level, and that is where your references at both the commodity line and the accounting line level, it's going to contain those references to the previous document in the procurement state that you used to copy forward to create the new one. So you can see just a screenshot here from a from a solicitation document. The commodity line reference has references back to the CRQS. Your award document is going to have references back if you had a requisition created to leading up to that award. So I know not all agencies at the agency delegated level use the requisition, but if you do, to reserve those funds, to pre-encumber those funds, make sure that you don't delete those references out on your subsequent documents. So the reference type determines the action that's to be taken against the reference document. So the default value on those is going to vary from one document to the next. So some of the line references, there's partial and there's final. They all have a specific role that they play. And depending on the type of document is, which options you're going to have available to you. So these are the 4 that you would typically see on your procurement, on your documents. Some of your procurement documents, and then some of the documents in the post-award process, like your INs and some of the corrective documents. Memo is not used very often. Basically, it is just if you have an external document that you want to be referenced there, you can do it as a memo type. It doesn't play any other kind of role, just basically just for reference purposes. Now, the partial and final, those are important when it comes to your procurement documents. So on your award document, partial and final references back to the requisition. And then also in part 2 of today's sessions, we're going to talk a little bit about the post-award and the payment process and the importance of these line references, whether you're selecting partial and final. So partial is when you're not, like in the payment process, you're not paying for that full amount, it's partial. The system is always, in most cases, going to default to partial, unless that line is for the full amount of the document that's being referenced. In that case, it will automatically change to final. We really recommend that in most cases, you let the system do that work for you. A lot of times, especially when it comes to the payment process, that reference will get changed to final. And what that final does is it liquidates that line. Or if it's at a reference level, it'll liquidate the referenced document line. And then, lo and behold, you have another payment that comes through and you've already closed the line out prematurely. And so that's where your corrective documents come into play. And that's typically what your inverse line reference is used, is when you have to process a corrective document like the IN and CEC. CEC is a commodity encumbrance correction document, and we see a lot of those because sometimes it gets closed out prematurely and you need to open that award document back up so that you can process your next payment because you changed it to final and maybe shouldn't have. So you want to be careful when you're going in and changing those references manually to make sure that it is in fact the final reference. And in some cases, you maybe shouldn't change that, and you should process maybe a change order to close out the rest of that award document. So you want to be very careful of those. The line references, when and when not. The line references, they are needed when, again, the document in the previous chain or the reference document needs to be liquidated. So we'll show an example of that on an award document in part 2. When you have that requisition referenced, when you need to change that from partial to final. So there will be a few examples specifically on your award documents. If your award is not going to be for the full amount of what your requisition amount was for, then you need to change those from partial to final so that you completely liquidate out that pre-encumbrance and it doesn't linger. An example where line references would not be needed. This would be a case where you've already went through the whole process, you've awarded your contract, and maybe you want to add a new separate commodity line for each renewal year. And that's common. You know, you like to try to keep everything organized and you want all of your records for year 1 to be on one commodity line, and then you want a second commodity line that wasn't included on the requisition to be the renewal line. You know, you wouldn't have line references back to the requisition in that case because it did not exist. So you can't have insert references to something that didn't exist on the previous document in the chain. So I can't see your head, so I'm hoping that there are some head nods, yes, that you understand this. I have a few in the room. I'll see if there's some head nods from them. Okay, but that happens sometimes. A lot of times how that can happen is on your award document, if you copy commodity line 1 to create your new commodity line, those references get copied with that line. And then when you validate, you get all these crazy errors that, like, you know, you can't reference a line that doesn't exist, or this line's already been closed because it's referencing back to commodity line 1 on the requisition. And you've already used that commodity line on the requisition. So you just need to delete those references out on the new line you're adding in that case because you didn't have those on the requisition, and you can't reference the line 1. You've already used line 1, and you just need to move on and start new. So that's an example where you would not need the requisition references, as if that line did not, commodity line 2 on the award did not have a commodity line 2 on the requisition. And of course, your agency and central delivery orders, they don't have references back to a requisition. You know, they can be partial because there's not anything on the master agreement that you need to close out, because remember, we're not encumbering anything at the master agreement level. Okay, so let's move on to creating a solicitation. I've been quite talkative and I can see I only have 10 minutes left. All right, so to create the solicitation, we're going to copy forward from the requisition and create that. So again, here's just some checklist for you, and I'm going to get over to the demo piece and let's just kind of walk through that. Oh, sorry. Okay, well, maybe this demo will go away in a minute. One second, I'm trying to get the demo to go away. No, it should, but it's not. Okay, well, you just have to try to see through the demo. I don't know why that's not going away. I'd blame it on the system, but you know, likely it was me, user. I have a saying I use on myself often: picnic is the problem in the chair, not in the computer. Okay, so you see that we had the requisition open, we copied forward, and we're selecting the RFQ. We're going to create a solicitation document, and in this case, we're just going to be an RFQ. Okay, the schedule of event, well, you can see, and here's the central purchase order. So you know we selected that procurement type on the requisition, and that is there. The solicitation category, I know sometimes that's left blank or just miscellaneous, but that is very helpful to the vendors and VSS as they are looking through to see if there are any solicitations in their area of expertise that they want to respond to. They have the option to search by the solicitation category, so that's helpful to them. Okay, so and that's one thing, I don't know if you saw that, the shipping and billing, you have to add that. I think that's something I'm going to look at, seeing if we can get that to carry over from the requisition to the solicitation document. That would be nice. I didn't do that here. And you can see we didn't have any reference documents there. The schedule of events, that's a new tab that was added with when we upgraded to 3.11. So it's not required, but it's kind of a nice feature. And what that does is if you have pre-bid meetings or mandatory pre-bid meetings, technical question deadline, any kind of deadline for questions, you know, we have some of the basic event codes entered for those. And this will make it more obvious and clear to those vendors in the schedule of events section of the solicitation if there are any type of meetings or deadlines that they need to be aware of, rather than you know, having them over in an additional information or extended description area of the solicitation. So it makes it more clear to them right up front if there's any kind of deadlines or question deadlines they need to know about. So you can add those if you want. You don't have to. You can select the event date that the pre-bid meeting needs to take place. Let's just move this along a little bit. We're going to take that out for the purposes of this. Just wanted to show you how that works. And there's some videos on my apps as well on some of these new features that came with 3.11. So your terms and conditions, that again, this is another area we have an issue with occasionally. Make sure that you're using attach. That's the only one you should be selecting, is attach. And what that does is it just attach a document and says see attach for terms and conditions, where you would upload your terms and conditions to the document. And always upload to the document header. So you can see here On your solicitation document, there's your requisition reference information. Your shipping and billing, you can copy that down from the header. If you go to the vendor list section, you can see that the vendor that we added from our requisition is automatically brought over and copied forward as well to that, as well as the free-form vendor. So all of that information, the more you can enter on the requisition, the more you're going to have already populated on the solicitation document. And then the commodity email push section. When you validate, this is going to populate with the commodity code that you've selected for your purchase, as well as the commodity codes that are above that one in the hierarchy. So this will allow you to cast as broad of a net as you want, or maybe you don't want that broad of a net, and I don't want to see every live plant and animal and that detailed. I just want to see the people that can give me just the animals. So you can right click and delete any of those lines if it's going to cast too broad of a net. Sometimes it's good to cast a broad net, sometimes you don't really need that. So just make you aware of some of the system functionality that's there. And then of course your let date, that's the date that the document's going to publish to VSS, depending on the time of day. So if it's late in the day after the last sync cycle, then it might be the next morning before that document publishes. And then your closing time and date, that's the date, the closing time, that's the deadline when vendors can submit their responses, and typically is also the same time that your opening will be. So purchasing typically has, purchasing division has their closings at 1:30 because that coincides with the 1:30 bid openings. Once those are closed and those come over, you can have the bid opening. Okay, so real quick, publishing to VSS. You want to make sure that you, of course, had your let date, needs to be the current date or a future date, can't be a past date. And your close date, of course, you know, you need that to be however many days out that you want to allow vendors to look at that and respond. Confirming the solicitation published, you can look at the header of your solicitation document, make sure there's a published date and time. If that's not populated after the next full sync cycle, then you need to go back and look at your document and see what might have happened. View the solicitation in VSS. So if you want to look at it, sometimes it helps to look at things from another person's perspective that's involved in the process. So you could go out there and look at it from like the vendor's perspective. And let me show you that real quick, how you can look in VSS. Did we have any questions coming in yet? Okay, so we'll look through and see what questions we have here real quick. I have 3 minutes left.
What is the difference between vendor and free-form vendor?
Okay, so the difference between the vendor list and the free-form vendor. Vendor list has to be a vendor that is out there, already exists in the vendor customer table. So if you know that vendor's out there for sure, you can go out there and search for their vendor customer code. You can find, you know, make sure that they have the email address out there. The system only sends electronic notifications of bid opportunities. So they have to have an email associated with that vendor account to send that. Freeform is if, you know, the vendor is not yet in VCUS, maybe they're a new vendor, or I don't know, we're all busy and maybe you don't have time to go out there and search VCUS to find every vendor you want to make sure gets this. So you have a salesperson that you know and they have an email address, you can use the freeform section as well.
And one more question. When that is checked for third-party approval, how is the appropriate agency notified? This came through earlier.
Okay, yeah, so for the third-party approval, that's where that reporting field 2. So when you include the reporting field 2 with the appropriate agency approver, third-party approval, when your agencies, there will be someone in your agency, there should be someone there in your agency that's identified as the agency third-party approver level 1. So that person will have that when that reporting field 2 is populated. The document will automatically, it will go into their work list. That person at your agency needs to take that document and reassign it to the appropriate approver at, say, the treasurer's office or the fleet office or the Office of Technology. When they reassign it to that appropriate third-party approver, it shows up in that person's work list. So they will see that, and they are usually looking for those types of documents in their work list. Okay, so let me go through this again real quick. When you go into VSS, I'm sorry, I can't get that demo off there. You can search by the open documents. If you're not seeing your document there, these are some of the things that you can do to troubleshoot to see why your solicitation did not publish. Because occasionally we get emails or calls that says my document doesn't look like it published. I don't know what happened. And maybe it's because it didn't assemble. That happens every now and then. You know, it's just like sometimes my iPhone takes fits and doesn't want to work. You know, you have to just kind of troubleshoot and see what the problem might have been. Sometimes it's self-inflicted when it doesn't work for me. Sometimes it's just the system just, you know, sometimes it just didn't assemble it for whatever reason. And usually you can go out there and try to manually assemble it or contact us and we'll get the document assembled so that it will publish. So just because it went final, you need to make sure it also assembled if you don't see that it published or you don't see at the header section that published date and time showed up right there. Okay, and in the cycle dashboard, I know I've went over this a million times before. That's this tab that you will see on your My Apps page. So you want to make sure you're monitoring that to know when the cycles ended. It runs every hour on the half hour. So what that does is it synchronizes new solicitations documents that need to go out to VSS and be published. It pushes them out. And any responses from vendors that came in for your bid closing, it brings those from that electronic lockbox and puts them in the procurement folder for you so that you can review those and then you can load them to your evaluation document if you're using the EV. Okay, I didn't lie. I told y'all I had a lot of information to talk about today. So this is just a glimpse, the cycle operations dashboard. Again, everybody has that on their My Apps homepage. And this is the detailed information on that, when it runs, what times to avoid. More questions?
Thank you, Lisa. You did fill up the time.
And part two, and there's more to come in part two.
Thank you all for participating.